have a rundown list of kind of the topics that we're going to do today. Obviously, we talked about a little bit about Bill Russell again. Don't want to, to go too crazy with it, but again, RIP the legend. We're going with the NBA tampering investigations. Of course, now we have two teams officially in the tampering bubble, or however you want to phrase it. We got the New York Knicks and the 76ers kind of in that situation. And then I thought we'd talk about a very interesting topic that I think both Pete and I are on the opposite ends of, and that's the salary cap discussion. Just kind of thinking about that more so as contracts continue to get higher and higher in the NBA, especially for players that, think are more so of a 2 or 3, but are getting paid like a 1. And so I kind of want to discuss, why that is and, kind of talk about that situation. And then, of course, we're going to talk about Colin Sexton. There's some rumors that, he wants 20 mil a year, which kind of leads right into our salary cap discussion. And then to kind of end the show, we got a Zion fat clause. There's a Zion weight clause that is going to be happening for Zion Williamson in terms of how he'll get his money, if he'll get his money. And so that's kind of what we're going to be doing here today on the charge. So without further ado, let's get right into the news. Okay, on our first story of the day, and of course we have two of them. That is, of course, the NBA opens investigation into potential tampering committed by the Knicks on Jalen Brunson. I know Pete's shaking in his boots right now. He might be losing Brunson on a free. Just kidding, he probably won't be. But the story goes on to say that the NBA has opened an investigation into possibly tampering committed by the Knicks and their signing of Jalen Brunson. Brunson, of course, left the Mavericks on a 4-year, $104 million with the Knicks. Brunson has a lot of ties with the Knicks between his father, Rick Brunson, who's an assistant coach, as long as Leon Rose, who's a lifelong friend. And, of course, I think that's what sparked the tampering charges there. And then, of course, to kind of also talk about the 76ers, they also opened to a violation committed by the Philadelphia 76ers on the grounds of signing James Harden, PJ Tucker, and Daniel House. Harden obviously declined his contract so he could get a more team-friendly deal for them. And some are wondering if Harden has another deal in place for the future, which would violate league rules. So, Pete, I know I talked a bunch. I just kind of talked really quickly about kind of the stories and what's been going on. What do you think is the biggest talking point when it comes to these tampering rules? And really, do you think that anything's going to happen to these organizations?
It's what we always talk about, right? I think that's why it doesn't bother me, or it doesn't really worry me, is what I should say. The NBA has run these tampering investigations over the last 5-10 years. Given I'm gonna try and think of the word I'm trying to say here, but it's given teams I guess you'd use the word the foresight to know they're not really going to get in very much trouble, right? They can kind of weigh what it's worth. The Knicks with Brunson in particular, he was so obviously tampered with, whatever that means in the NBA's definition of what tampering is. They clearly tampered with him, right? They hired his dad right before agency even started. It was a done deal. He didn't even take that meeting with Dallas, because he had already practically signed on the dotted line before free agency had even opened. So I think what it comes down to is until the NBA either decides, A, this is a bigger deal and we need to punish teams accordingly, or B, they just keep doing it the way it is, why would any team really worry about it? It really depends on the player you're trying to sign. And I would argue if you're the Knicks, and I'm not saying, we've never really talked too in depth about the Brunson signing and the crazy range of expectations with a player like Brunson getting signed to the deal he did. But I would argue that signing Brunson is at least worth giving up your second round pick, right? Some second round pick. It's not that big of a loss.
Yeah.
And that is that's pretty much all we've seen. Have we ever seen a harsher punishment than a second round pick being taken away?
So far, no, and I'm curious to see if the owners and the league office are gonna. I think this is gonna be the true test for them as we continue to move on, because it seems like tampering charges will never go away, right? People are gonna continue to commit them. People are gonna continue to say, "Oh, well, I didn't really know," and things like that. And so, in my opinion, I think the only way that you really stop it from the owner's perspective is you have to come down with a harsh punishment. You can't. And again, I think for most part, what and it goes to your point too. It's like you treat it as if it's kind of like a low level offense anyway. So why even punish these teams for making those type of commitments in the first place anyway? I understand you want it to be the integrity of every team has an opportunity to talk to you. Every team has an opportunity to kind of get to know you before you do secretly things behind the backs of others. But at the same time, I don't see really how things are going to change if they continue to make it a low level offense. And like I said, if they really want to really be hard on it, the best way to do it is by making a very harsh punishment. Maybe you say, "Sorry, Brunson, you thought you were going to the Knicks. Nah, you're gonna stay a free agent, and now you got to re-sign with somebody else." And I mean, and then it becomes a whole legality of it. I'm not sure what the implications of that would be. Like, does it make it a null and void contract then? If you're tampering with, like, if they find out that you're tampering, that's the biggest question mark for me as we continue to see these players continue to have these tampering charges. What happens to them? Because again, that's a lot of money to be messed with, right? You don't want to mess with someone's money because then you could get sued that way. So I think to me that's the question mark for the NBA. And before you talk, Pete, I just have I apologize that I cannot read your name. But your message says soon the European Championship for the national teams in basketball. The favorites won Slovenia, France, Serbia, Greece, Lithuania. All European stars of the NBA are coming to play. Hey,
I mean,
we are big stands of the European basketball movement. At least I am.
talking about it for years. I mean,
Yeah.
we've been on it for years. I mean, we've
Mm-hmm.
seen the writing on the wall. Like these dudes, basketball is a world sport now. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it 100% is.
Yep.
And we could get into a deeper conversation of like the American way of raising up these young players and the toll it
Mm-hmm.
takes on them, and the skill set developed. Like it is different. We're seeing a revolution in terms of European basketball.
Yeah.
But it's pretty interesting. Going back to the tampering though, like my opinion, I don't think they'll ever make as harsh a punishment as
No,
that. Like
I don't think so
just
either.
saying you're off the team. There's no way they can get away with that. Just in the sense that all of, like you said, the legality that it opens up in terms of the NBA, the contract for the player, the age, everything. It just makes it such a mess. I don't think they would ever do that. I think really what it comes down to, and maybe this is the NBA's perspective, tampering is one thing, right? Like it basically just amounts to you're talking to a player before free agency is open, right? It doesn't necessarily, and maybe this is other people would have a different opinion. I don't necessarily think tampering really changes the teams that these players would go to. You know what I mean? Like Jalen Brunson, regardless if they had tampered with him, in my opinion, they
Mm-hmm.
could have hired his dad, and it's not tampering, right?
Yeah.
The connection to Leon Rose and Worldwide Wes and Tom Thibodeau and Derrick Rose and all these connections Jalen Brunson has to the Knicks, they all existed of tampering, right? So the question is, if we punish this team super hard for tampering, does that really change anything? Would he have gone somewhere else? And the question is probably not. Like, I don't really think so. Just in the mere sense, and let's go away from just the Knicks in particular, right? We have forever heard of like free agency destinations. That's been a buzzword
Mm-hmm.
in all sports forever, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is a free agency destination? And it basically boils down to big markets, well known teams, teams with legacy, or just in general nice cities, right?
Right.
Tampering doesn't necessarily affect what those markets are that are going to bring in free agents, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. I think it might influence into a specific market maybe a little earlier than otherwise. It's basically just like a slight head start on another team.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe that's the question. Maybe you come up with some punishment to say, we're going to slow you down in some other facet of the business, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's the answer, because really tampering, I don't really know if it's that big of a deal. I really don't. Like these teams do it all the time, no matter what. They all do it.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of even hard to determine what tampering's effect on the league actually is. Like it's probably always existed and it probably always will, regardless of the punishment. You cannot stop
Yeah.
people from talking to their friends, talking to loved ones with other organizations. You
Mm-hmm.
can't do that. Tampering
Yeah.
is always going to be a thing. If anything, more maybe you have to change the stigma attached to what tampering is. You know, maybe you have to
Hmm.
try and rework like what tampering actually is and how it affects the league into a way that is not so negative. Because I actually think like a lot of the negativity surrounding the word tampering is made by the NBA. I think they make that a bigger issue than it needs to be.
Hmm.
It's going to exist regardless. That's kind of why I've always thought like tampering is what it is. It's
Yeah.
going to exist. It's more a matter of how publicly facing we're going to tamper with
Yeah.
players, right? Because
Hmm.
like that's the biggest issue, I think. When you have like LeBron is basically recruiting a new GM to his city in the middle of All-Star weekend, right?
Hmm.
He's trying to get Sam Presti to come to come
Lakerland.
to the Lakers and replace Rob Pelinka, right?
Yeah.
That that is about as tampering as you can get, and it's publicly facing. He's doing it in a press conference. I mean, what does that really do, though? It doesn't really mean anything. He's just saying,
Hmm.
"I like Sam Presti, and I'd prefer him as my GM." If anything, that's hurting his team.
Yeah.
I actually think a lot of the times tampering is like a double-edged sword. Like it kind of goes both ways.
Hmm.
So, I don't know, man. I'm kind of sick of tampering in a lot of ways. Like I really think it's a much bigger deal than it needs to be. It's more, I mean, it's really like, you know, maybe these small market towns that get really upset about it. But the bigger question is, regardless of if Knicks tampered with Jalen Brunson, was Jalen Brunson going to go to Oklahoma City, right?
Hmm.
No. Was he going to go to anywhere that's a smaller market than New York City or somewhere where he was already probably destined to go from the beginning? Probably not.
Probably
Tampering
not.
didn't change that. It
No.
didn't change that. So, how harsh are we going to punish the Knicks for a decision that was made before they tampered anyway? I
Yeah.
don't know. And you know, a lot of people would say you're being a homer, but I would say that for even my most despised teams in the NBA, I would argue that guy was probably going to go there anyway. So,
Yeah. I mean, we keep having these conversations year after year, Pete. I mean, from Lonzo Ball to Jalen Brunson to James Harden, these conversations will continue to happen because teams and players are trying to get on the same page beforehand. And again, does it suck for the teams like Oklahoma City Thunder and the Memphis Grizzlies and many of these other organizations that usually don't get those star players anyway? Unless, like I said, unless there's like even LeBron James tampered years ago, if you remember his decision, right? That whether he was going to stay in Cleveland, like they talk before the season, and
oh yeah,
the consensus was even LeBron in Cleveland doesn't guarantee the signing of Bosch and Wade. They had to go somewhere else to go do that, right? Miami was the destination at the end of the day, and so to me, these organizations, these teams are going to continue to do that because they understand that the star players don't want to play in those markets. And again, it'll probably contradict my talking point for the next topic that we'll talk about with the salary cap.
hmm
But what I will say about it is that's not how the Memphis Grizzlies built their team. That's not how the Oklahoma City Thunder are building their team. They understand where they're at in the NBA atmosphere of what was the phrase that you used last week, Pete? I guess it was timeline, but they know their role
yeah,
is
yeah.
more
Just
so
understanding the timeline. Yeah,
understanding the
they
timeline,
understand it.
understanding their role in the NBA. Maybe just maybe if you have a superstar, you could possibly bring them over, but at the end of the day, they don't want to play in those areas. They don't want to get signed over there. They're not going to listen to a pitch from the Oklahoma City Thunder, even though it's Presti. But they're not going to listen to his pitch, being like, "Okay, I know your project. You're taking way too long for where I want to be at right now. I want to win championships. I win championships by playing right now with players and teammates that are about my age to go forward for a championship." And so, like you said, Pete, they know their timelines, and I think these organizations at the end of the day understand it. I think it's just something for them to complain about because they feel like they're unheard, and I think it's more so from the owners than the GMs, and that must be a huge disconnect somewhere when they're talking to one another.
I like, and realistically, and this would be really my last point. Like, I honestly think tampering is overplayed. You know, I really
Mm-hmm.
do. Like, it's really just only people who really care about it are the team where the player doesn't sign like original. Like, it's Dallas, right?
Yeah.
It's Dallas is upset about it, probably. That's probably who's filing complaints.
And Twitter.
Or yeah, and Twitter and small market GMs. Those are the people who care, right?
Yeah.
But even then, wasn't going to go to any of your places. Like the Knicks talking to them didn't matter. You know,
Yeah.
talking to Brunson didn't matter. You could even go back to like the 70s, right? And look at when Kareem requested to be traded to the Lakers. Like you're telling me there was no tampering back then in terms of the Lakers
Yeah.
players reaching out to Kareem to come play in LA. There's
Yeah.
no shot that that was happening. Like wasn't happening. There's no shot. Why pretend that these guys don't talk? Why pretend? Because even then, like if you're gonna really get in depth to it, how do you solve a situation like the Knicks front office having connections to a guy like Brunson? Like
Hmm.
they have known that kid since he was literally a kid, like a young
Yeah.
child. You cannot stop that from being a thing, and they're not the only situation like that in the NBA. They're not. If anything, maybe if you lower the stigma of tampering, what it is, and you encourage, maybe not encourage it, but maybe just like make it not as big of a deal. You can have these teams that don't get free agencies have conversations for longer amounts of time and convince these players to go places they otherwise wouldn't go. Maybe it solves the big market bias for free agencies or for free agents in general. So I really don't know. If anything, I think we need to get into our next discussion and we can kind of come back and keep talking about tampering.
Yeah, but let me quickly answer Sean's question. What tamperings have these teams been doing? Like specific actions? Basically, Sean, there's a period in which during the summer you're not allowed to talk to other players, or teams aren't allowed to talk to players, players aren't allowed to talk to teams, and there's like this time period where things could get done. But in the past, we've seen a lot of these players and people really talk about kind of what they want to do. So, for example, like Lonzo, for example, talked to the Bulls before the opening free agency day about like, hey, what can the Chicago Bulls offer me as a player, and many other things of that nature. And you're not allowed to do that before the season starts, and so you need to wait until the free agency period. So there's a period in time in which, I think it's like at the end of I think even since, from the start of the NBA season until free agency, you're not allowed to talk to another team or player. Like players aren't really supposed to talk to players, but they do anyway. Or actually, I don't think that's true. Players are not allowed to talk to the teams beforehand.
Oh,
So, like for example, if like Lonzo Ball
you
is
could do
talking
players too.
players, oh
Players
wow,
talking to players. That's definitely happened before. I've heard of
yeah,
that for sure.
yeah. And so, for example, like Lonzo Ball, if you're not allowed to for him, he's not allowed to talk to the Bulls since the year before he became a free agent and signed with the Bulls. Like you're not allowed to do that whatsoever. And so those are kind of the actions. Like you're talking about contracts, probably talking about team situation. Like, hey, what are you going to do for me to form this team around me? Here's what we're doing. We're signing this, this, and this, and other things like that. But there's another question I want to ask you, Pete, and I know I don't want to go beat around a dead bush here for this topic for too long, but I was going to ask you about, and it's right here. Do we have to blame, and I have them up here on my screen, do we have to blame guys like Wojnarowski and Shams for what's going on with the tampering? Because, like you said, in the past, without Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and many other players in the 70s and 80s were probably doing this. They're probably talking to other teams, talking to teammates, saying like, hey, you should sign here. And probably had a deal in place beforehand. Like, do you feel like that's kind of the way? Do you blame these guys at all, or no?
If anything, they're a byproduct of a system that's been around way before they existed. Like I said, I really think tampering, whatever tampering is supposed to mean by NBA standards and by these other, leagues, tampering has and always will exist in sports as long as people can talk to each other. It will exist because even your description of tampering, like such a loose and fluid thing, whatever it is, right? Who knows when the Knicks started talking to Jalen Brunson? They might have literally started talking to him the minute that Worldwide Wes and Leon Rose were hired by the Knicks to run the front office. That was two full seasons ago, almost 3 full seasons ago. So if we're going to take that into consideration, what even is tampering? What's a punishment for tampering? How long does it have to be before a season to even be considered tampering? Because realistically, they could have said to Jalen Brunson a season and 3 seasons ago, right? Because I believe Leon Rose was his agent. You know, he could have said, hey, your contract expires in 2.5 years with the Mavericks. When it comes up, keep performing. I'm going to send you whatever the most reasonable big contract I can, and you're going to come here, right? And they agreed on it 3 seasons in advance. They could have. I'm not saying that's what happened. Could have happened, right? How can you possibly punish that? Or how can you possibly monitor that
Yeah.
realistically? And I think that's kind of that term I just used, that double-edged sword of the NBA, right? They honestly, I believe, encourage tampering because they have guys like Woj, they have guys like Shams, and all these dudes who do a lot in terms of keeping the NBA hot topic to discuss throughout the offseason and year round. And that's where, a few years ago, what was the big term everybody used? That basketball is becoming a 365-day-a-year sport, right?
Yeah.
That was like 4 years ago that people
Mm-hmm.
really started talking about that.
Yeah.
Not exist without tampering.
Exactly. And really
I
quick,
genuinely,
oh
yeah,
no,
yeah.
go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I genuinely don't believe that the NBA could advertise themselves the way they do if they didn't have tampering. We would have a significant chunk of the year where we did not have anything to talk about if there was no tampering. So that's just me. I think there are people would definitely disagree with that in the
Mm-hmm.
NBA. It's just
Yeah.
I think you're lying to yourself. That's where Woj and Shams and all these guys get their information. They get their
Yeah.
information from tampering that's occurring in the places and times where those discussions aren't supposed to be happening.
Yeah. And so to kind of continue, I just want to give a definition to Sean, a more, more accurate, more like by the books. The NBA tampering or anti-tampering rules suggest that teams, players, or coaches cannot approach or lure players on rival teams when they are bound by contracts with their respective teams. This includes publicly stating interest in acquiring the services of a player or by contacting his agent about a possible trade. Which, we could look at that last sentence and, kind of point the fingers at LeBron in that sense. But, it's kind of. But here's the thing: like, if players like, and the reason why I think that last part of it, and we probably should get to the salary cap very soon. We've almost spent like a half an hour talking about this topic. But the biggest thing for me here, Pete, all these players share an agent, right? So at what point do these players not be like, are these agents bound by saying, "Oh, I can't tell you what my client's doing"? Like, hey, is Rich Paul really bound by the CBA or like the rules to be like, LeBron, like here's what Anthony Davis is thinking.
Of course he's not.
Yeah. I mean, it's just kind
I
of
mean,
like,
he is on paper. He is on paper, but that's not the NBA's business. The NBA would not make as much money if
yeah,
people like Rich Paul did not do Rich Paul things.
yeah,
I genuinely believe that. It is a gift and a curse to have this much power to as many people in the NBA as have power, right?
yeah,
It comes with its benefits and it comes with its negatives,
mm-hmm.
Giving people and the players and the agents as much power as they've done has made the most mundane basketball topic an actual conversation amongst the hardcore fans. That's why we can talk about basketball as much as we do on a channel like this. That's why there's a million basketball podcasts to be listened to. 90% of the time, they're all talking about the same thing, but at least it's a new topic from the last podcast, right? Or the last stream or whatever it is. It's because of people like that who have power and sway to make things happen all year round in a league where that is not technically the way that the rules are written.
Yeah.
So that's where the NBA really needs to make its decision. They really need to make a choice, like in terms of they keep pretending this is a big deal. Are we going to pretend it's a big deal and convince fans it really matters? Because at the end of the day, it really doesn't. It doesn't
Yeah.
change where people want to go. It doesn't change the connections they have with friends and family. Because even then, what the grayest of gray areas might be this Brunson situation. His agent was Leon Rose, the front office head of the New York Knicks,
Yeah.
only a few seasons ago.
Mm-hmm.
that is a super conflicting set of interests in terms
Yeah.
of these rules and what these guys could have and should have and would have said to each other over the last few years. And even right before Leon Rose left as his agent from CAA.
Mm-hmm.
Huge deal. But
Yeah.
there's no way to really determine what that means and how you can punish or whatever it is, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, there's so many great areas. We could talk about this for hours, but I want to let you guys kind of comment on this video. What do you guys think about the NBA tampering? Are you for it? Are you against it? If you are an NBA owner or GM and you put your hat on that, what do you guys think would happen? Or what do you guys think should happen to these teams that tamper? Should anything happen? Should nothing happen? We want to know what your guys' comments and opinions are in the comment section below. And please remember to hit that comment, like, and please remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Again, all that stuff helps out the algorithm. And again, we do appreciate you guys for that 1,000 subscribers. And let's move on to our next topic.